All right, let's move on to Roman numeral 3, talking about slavery in America. This is a national problem, and it really has been since the outset of the country. They had been importing slaves from Africa and using the triangular trade in order to get molasses and slaves and other goods all transferred around the world. Whoops, no, this was supposed to happen. Hang on. And get transferred all over the world. And it was a national problem. And when you think about this issue of slavery in America, it was something that, I mean, maybe could have been dealt with at the very outset of the country, but everybody was a little bit nervous about what that would really mean for the country. But by the late 1700s, there were over 500,000 slaves in North America. Now, it does include Canada and stuff, but that's a lot of slaves. That's a lot of people that are working, that are being sold into slavery and working for nothing and cannot have any control over their life. That should be though, not thought. Though the South had the majority of slaves, the North did have slavery as well. I think one of the problems is we tend to just think that slavery, once you got a certain area to the North, just died off, and that slavery didn't exist in the North. That's simply not true. Slavery, a lot of times, was allowed in the North, especially it kind of went under the auspice of kind of like what they call a grandfather clause, meaning it's always been that way, so why change it? And so, though the South had the majority of slaves, the North did have slavery as well, so it wasn't completely outlawed in the North. Now, eventually they will try to do that, but a lot of times slavery did exist there. Both regions financially benefited from slave labor. Now, I put benefited in quotes there because I feel horrible saying that people are benefiting from slave labor. However, economically and financially, both did manage to make money from slave labor. Whether that was the South that was selling cotton and selling it to the North, who then shipped it, or whether that was the North that was getting, produce, farm produce, goods like that, as far as like agricultural goods from slave labor, and they would sell it as well. So both regions were financially benefiting from slave labor. However, the South was way more reliant on slave labor than the North was. And as the 1800s continued on, many began to believe that slavery was morally wrong. It wasn't that people didn't necessarily believe that it was morally wrong at the outset of the country. People did. They just didn't really know how to stop it because it had already been going. Now you look back and say, well, you just say you can't have slaves. And that should have been what they would have done, but they were too nervous about losing states to not sign the Constitution and get the country unified on the Constitution first, which is, unfortunate. And so as the 1800s, many more voices became loud. They were louder voices declaring that slavery was morally wrong. I want to show you a picture here. 1790 census. This is enslaved persons per square mile. Now notice where most of the slaves are at in the 1790s. Again, we pretty much have the 13 colonies here, concentrated right in the northeastern part of Virginia, southwestern part of Maryland, North Carolina, and then South Carolina. That's where most of them were at. Now I want to show you the updated picture in the 1800s, covering the time period that we talked about. A little bit more grainy here on this one, but this is the best I could do. 1860 census. Look at the amount of slaves. Now, I will say this. We are not counting the North. Notice it says not available because they didn't really keep track just because it wasn't a dominant thing. However, look at where these areas are at. South Carolina. Tons and tons of slaves in South Carolina. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana. All of these areas had deep roots of slavery. And so you look at this picture here, and you just have quite the difference here. You look back and forth at these. And slavery had just continued to spread. And so as a result, we're going to talk a little bit about what the life of a slave was like in the South. First of all, as far as their work goes, it was usually manual and physical labor. Very physical labor, very manually oriented, meaning what they would have to do is work out in the fields. They would have to sow seeds. They would have to plant stuff. They would have to pick weeds. They would also have to pick cotton. They would have to get the fields ready for harvest, feed animals, and most of it was very backbreaking work. and it was mostly in agrarian settings. The word agrarian just basically means agricultural. And so this is mostly in agrarian settings, meaning if you were outside, you're basically doing farm work. And that's mainly because most of the South was oriented around the farm work idea. And so that was what they were doing, manual and physical labor, and mostly in agrarian settings. Depending on the master, some slaves were whipped and beaten. Now, I think we tend to think that every slave was beaten to a bloody pulp every single day. And though slavery is horrifically wrong, and though slaves did get beaten and did get whipped, it really depended on the master. It was not an everyday occurrence. Now, let me ask you this, and I know you guys can't answer me here, but why would you think that them beating the slaves would not be an everyday occurrence? Give you guys a second to kind of think this over. You're answering right now. Some of you are giving good answers. The reason is, if you beat a slave to the point where they cannot work, then that means you lose money and you lose production. If they can't bend over to pick cotton or to farm fields, then you lose money and you lose production. So masters kind of had to be picky and choosy about when they did beat them. And it's unfortunate that we even have to discuss this. But it is true that they did not beat them every single day. They couldn't. It was too much of an investment. And that's what they were worried about losing. They weren't, you think like, well, why weren't they worried about like actually hurting a human being? That wasn't really the thought in their mind, unfortunately. However, if slaves were beaten too badly, that should be TOO. I apologize. I'll fix that a little bit later on. Finding a whole bunch of errors here. This is why you don't do this stuff late at night, I guess. The master would lose money and production, and so they had to be very careful about this. You didn't want to lose too much money by beating them. However, scenes like this did happen. And a little bit grainy here, but you can kind of see this is a slave that had been beaten a lot and whipped. So for us to say that it didn't happen is simply untrue. Now, why would a slave get beaten like this? Well, slaves a lot of times would work too slow for the masters, and masters didn't like that, and so they would beat them to try to motivate them. You did have some slaves that would, purposely sabotage tools so they didn't have to work. They would steal from the master or whatever. And so as a result, you would have this. They would run away from their master and they would get whipped. And a lot of times in the slave trade, if you saw a slave with a lot of scars on their back from being whipped, you wouldn't want to buy one of them, mainly because that was a fear that you would have to be doing the same and that they were more of a problem than they were a solution. Another way that they would actually prevent slaves and they would actually put them in subjugation was the weird collars like this. And what these collars would do is, before they would go out and work, they would put these collars on them. And it's kind of hard to see here, but these collars would have like little bells on them. And basically what they would do is they would put these on the slaves, and they would put them on them. A lot of times, sometimes they'd even put them on them like in the evening time so that they couldn't escape. And if they did, they could hear them. And people would well know that this was an escaped slave if they caught them in this situation. So this is kind of a different type of bond. They would put them in a different type of bondage that they would put them in. And this is another one, an iron collar for preventing the escape of slaves, mainly because it would be very, very hard for you to run away with this setting on. People would notice you very, very well. You couldn't go through the wooded areas, as well as it would be very tough to sleep. And so this is another way. So again, all of these are just horrific ways and examples of how the masters would subjugate these individuals and torture them. And this is some of the stuff that did happen in the South. As far as their family life, slaves were able to have families, but it was rather controlled, meaning they weren't technically allowed to be legally married because they were not technically citizens, and so they couldn't be legally married. But you did have slaves that would get married. They did have kids, and a lot of times, if a set of slaves had kids, those kids would also be slaves to that master, and they would just stay within the family. And slaves were able to have families, but it was rather controlled. The slave families tended to want to stick together. But once the kids were able to, they had to work just as much as the adults would. They would have the kids do certain tasks that the adults maybe couldn't do, or small tasks that kids could do, and they made them go to work as well. And I would highlight this. One of the biggest fears of the slaves was to be separated from their family, mainly because family was the only thing they had. And so, one of the biggest threats that a master could have towards a family or towards a slave would be that they would separate them. They would sell them to another slave owner and separate them from their family, or they would take their kids away from them. And that was about what they had. See, the slaves were a very close knit community. They kind of almost had to be. And as they were working together, they grew. They just had this bond, and these families would have this bond because they had to stick together. And so, a big fear of the slaves was to be actually separated from family. Nobody really wanted that to happen. And you guys might be like, "That's a fear of mine too." Yes, correct. But you have to understand that the slave family, that was all they knew. On that plantation, that was all they knew. The other thing you have to understand is this, is that not every Southerner owned slaves. Slaves were expensive to buy, and they were expensive to maintain. You're having to pay for another set of people. And so not every person in the South owned slaves. And when you think of people that own slaves, don't think of like 600 slaves working on a farm. It was maybe like two families max a lot of times. I mean, if you had more than that, you were extremely rich and wealthy. And most people didn't have that. Slave responses. As far as slaves and how they responded, well, many did try to escape from their owners. That was a normal thing. They would try to escape and run away. They would wait till at night, and this is why they were shackled at night. This is why they were chained together at night a lot of times. But they would try to escape. They wouldn't be living in the master's house, although some did. It just kind of depended on how the master treated them. If the master treated them as just like one of the family, they might live in the house. But most of them lived in like a separate quarters, maybe in like a farmhouse or something like that. That probably wasn't a very nice farmhouse. But many tried to escape from their owners. And one of the means by which they did this was the Underground Railroad. And I'm sure you guys have heard of this, but the Underground Railroad developed as a way of getting slaves to freedom. And they called it the Underground Railroad because it was basically like a path. It wasn't actual railroads, so don't think of it like actual trains because that would draw too much attention. What it was a series of routes that went from the south, secret routes that went from the south and made several stops to get to the north to try to get the slaves up north to areas where they were technically free. Even they would try to get them to Canada if they could to get them completely out of the country. And so it was kind of cool how they did this. But what they would do is they wouldn't use the slaves' actual names. One of the things that they would do is they would actually give them like Bible names because the slaves really thought that they were like the children of Israel and they were sold into slavery and they were in subjugation and they kind of were. And so they would have names like Moses and Abraham. And they would have, for women, names like Ruth and Esther. And so they kind of gave these nicknames, but they would have a series of secret routes that would get up to the north. And this would be kind of the paths that they would take. It would be areas that could get them from Georgia down to Florida and out to sea, South Carolina, North Carolina, up on the oceans here, come through the mountains up to here, up to Canada, Mississippi. And they had these routes that would be very well-worn routes, and to try to get them out of the slave states and up to the free states. And this would be kind of the way that they would use the Underground Railroad, a very fascinating way to do it. They would only move them at night, and they would hide them in houses along the way that they knew were were against slavery, and that would allow them to get north. So, pretty cool system.